Hello, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar from the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm Hallie Leinhart, Outreach and Communications Manager at IRP. Our webinar today will explore the important topic of supporting fathers and their families surrounding separation. We have 5 speakers today who will explore the consequences of separations and strategies to support fathers and their families in sustaining and reestablishing relationships surrounding separation. First, we'll hear from Dr. Tova Walsh, an associate professor in the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work here at UW-Madison. She's also an IRP affiliate. We'll hear from Dr. Clinton Boyd Jr., executive director at Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communities. We'll hear from Jonathan Gonzalez, Military Family Projects Director at the 0 to 3 organization. We'll hear from Dr. Alamu, Assistant Professor of Sociology and Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northeastern University. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Paha Charles, Associate Professor at the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work, also here at UW-Madison. Thank you all for being here. This webinar is co-produced with the Wisconsin Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention Board. Please note that the views expressed by our speakers don't necessarily represent the opinions or policies of the Institute for Research on Poverty or of any other sponsor, including the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We have an hour today, and after we hear from each of our presenters, we'll spend the last 10 minutes or so at the end for a live Q&A. You can type those in through the Q&A box. We did get quite a few questions submitted as people registered, so we will be possibly queuing up some of those as well. I hope you will all feel free to participate through the chat. We'd love to know who you are and where you're joining us from today. I also want to let you know that we have closed captions enabled, so you can toggle those on and off at the bottom of your screen. We will be posting the recording of the webinar within a few days, and you will receive a link via email along with the slides. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Tova Walsh.
Thank you and welcome, everyone. It's great to see in the chat how many people are joining from all across the country. I'm going to put a link in the chat right now. This is one in a series of father-focused webinars, and there are recordings available if you want to check out some of the others. Please do kind of keep your introductions coming. We're kind of happy to know where you're joining from. So I'm going to move quickly because I'm super excited to hear from our 4 presenters and have time for your questions and discussion at the end. Just by way of framing the conversation that we are about to have, I want to share with you that we know that millions of US children have experienced extended separation from a father for multiple reasons. Could be due to military deployment, as we'll hear about, employment demands, as in the case of some of our northern Wisconsin communities, where folks need to spend seasonally periods of time employed elsewhere out of the community, child welfare intervention, parental incarceration, immigration detention or deportation, and many other reasons that people might experience extended family separations. We also know that many children experience shorter periods of separation on a regular basis from a parent, for example, due to custody arrangements. And we know that children and parents alike experience stress during times of separation, and all the more so when the separation is associated with fear and uncertainty. This panel brings together a diverse group of scholars and practitioners who I am so excited to hear from. Their work relates to relationship disruption and repair from a variety of perspectives. And I am excited that we get to hear from them, bring them together in conversation about the circumstances and consequences of separation, surrounding separation, and strategies for supporting fathers and their children and families in sustaining and reestablishing relationships. So we've got an exciting group to hear from. I'm going to turn to Clinton Boyd, Dr. Clinton Boyd Jr. in just a moment here. If you want to bring your slides up, you're welcome to, and start screen sharing while I read a brief introduction. So Dr. Clinton Boyd Jr. stepped into the role of Executive Director of Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communities in Chicago in 2021, bringing a wealth of lived-in academic experience to this organization. He is a scholar practitioner. He believes in recognizing Black fathers as invaluable assets to their children, families, and communities. And he is going to kick us off by speaking about distance as protection. And so I'll turn it to you now, Clinton.
Thank you. First and foremost, I just want to acknowledge how honored and humbled I am to be numbered among my co-panelists today, but also to have an opportunity to address an august body of scholars, practitioners, and policymakers who are doing very important work throughout the various communities of the U.S. I plan to be exceedingly brief today because I have to be to make time for my co-panelists to also present. And so I just wanted to start off by talking a little bit about work we've been doing here in Chicago at an organization that I run called Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communities. For the past 4 years, we've spent quite a bit of time working in various communities, specifically alongside various community violence intervention organizations, to really tackle this issue of community violence, specifically gun violence. And one of the things that we've immediately learned in the process of doing this work is that fatherhood and fatherhood programming is actually a violence prevention strategy. And so whenever fathers are supported, connected, and resources, families stabilize and our communities ultimately become safer. And through our work with fathers who are navigating environments where community violence is a real daily concern, we began to notice something very important. And for us, it was really this whole notion that there were behaviors that systems would often interpret as father disengagement or absence. But when we listened to the fathers we were working with within these community violence intervention organizations, what we saw was something very different. What looked like distance was really this very often an intentional protection that was taking place when fathers would choose to distance themselves from their children and families as they're attempting to get their lives together. And so today's brief presentation really grows out of the work that we've been doing in that space for the past several years, hence the title of my presentation. So, to just start with, today I just really want to explore this concept that emerges frequently when we were working with our fathers and communities affected by violence. This whole idea that what systems interpret as father absence may actually be a protective strategy. And oftentimes, what happens is these two primary assumptions emerge. One of the most common problems we encounter in doing this work is the assumption that physical distance means disengagement, which in some scenarios that's indeed the case, but that's not how things unfold in the context of the work that we're doing. And then the second one is that reduced visibility really equates lack of care, but those assumptions often ignore the realities that many fathers are navigating communities impacted by violence. And so a father may avoid certain locations because of retaliation risk could place them, their children, or their partners in danger. He may intentionally limit his visibility because ongoing conflicts make certain spaces unsafe. And he may also just be navigating system involvement that restricts where he can and cannot go safely. And so from the outside, this looks like absence. But when we listen closely to the fathers themselves, what we often see instead is a father making difficult strategic intentional decisions about how to protect his family. And so for us, it was important to reframe separation and really think about what does it look like for the unique and distinct subgroup of fathers we're working with? And in that case, this is when distance serves as an act of protection. And so when we just reframe these situations through the lived experiences of the fathers we're working with, a different pattern just becomes clear. Again, many fathers are intentionally avoiding spaces where retaliation risk is high. They sometimes temporarily relocate, sometimes to different parts of the state, sometimes to different states because they need to lay low for a period of time. They may also limit their visibility due to basically reduce threats to themselves, children, and other family members, and they intentionally create distance during these periods of active conflict. So again, this would signal that these intentional acts are intentional acts of protection, not necessarily disengagement. And so when we look at this through a strengths-based lens, we can actually reframe the conversation from the perspective that many of the fathers are navigating or displaying what we would call situational awareness, self-regulation under threat. They're demonstrating their protective instincts, and they're also thinking long term about their safety, their children's safety, and the safety of their families. And so, again, these are really protective parenting behaviors under extreme conditions that we have to be mindful of. So when we think about some of the implications for practitioners, I think it's important for us to recognize the protective decision making that many of our fathers are engaging in. Practitioners, again, must really recognize that distance can sometimes be a form of protection rather than disengagement, and therefore a program should really assess the safety dynamics fathers are navigating rather than making assumptions about commitment. Secondly, we need to lead with an asset-based lens, just because I think it's important for us to recognize that our fathers have strengths that they bring to the table when they show up at our programs. They don't always have needs. They also have strengths that can be leveraged. Third, we really need to provide trauma-informed support for our fathers and make sure that the programs and the spaces that we create for them allow our fathers to process violence exposure, strengthen their emotional regulation, and really just deepen their parenting relationships. And then the last point I'll make on this slide is that we need to create pathways for transformation and leadership. How can you take a father who once may have been involved in violent activities within his community, but now turn him into a credible messenger where he can leverage his hard earned experience on the streets in ways that can inspire change in other men who are trying to transform their lives for the better? And I do believe fatherhood programs can be leveraged in such a way. The last slide is really talking about some of the policy implications that I believe we should uplift in this work. First and foremost, we really need to strengthen support for fathers and families. And so that means really expanding access to more evidence-informed fatherhood and family support programs. Secondly, we need to prioritize prevention and early support. So it means that we make those investments early and often in the lives of our fathers and our men rather than only responding after a crisis occurs. Third, we need to expand economic opportunity for our fathers so they can provide stability for themselves and their families. And then the last point that I will make is we need to reduce and ultimately eliminate a lot of the systemic and structural barriers that disrupt family stability. So we're talking about barriers related to housing stability. We really need to continue to interrogate the way that our child support system operates in practice. While some of our policies administratively and otherwise have changed, that doesn't always mean that has made its way down to the implementation on the ground. And so we need to definitely continue to think about what is the application of some of these policies that have changed for the better look like for some of our fathers on the ground. And then also there's always opportunities to do more work in the reentry space. And so being mindful of time, I will stop there and say thank you, and allow my other colleagues to share their expertise with the group gathered here today. So again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to hearing more during the discussion, but you've kicked us off beautifully, including, I think, for many of us thinking about protective decision making and some of the things that might not have been top of mind when we heard the topic about supporting families surrounding separation and bringing that asset-based lens. So thank you, Clinton. I'm going to turn next to Jonathan Gonzalez, and I'll read an introduction while he's bringing his slides up. So Jonathan currently serves as 0 to 3's Military Family Projects Director, where he works to establish funding, develop and maintain relationships with military community partners, and create opportunities to expand the ability of 0 to 3 to support young children in military connected families. Jonathan also serves in the Arizona Army National Guard as a logistics officer and previously held the position of Arizona National Guard State Family Program Director. So we are excited to hear from you and bring in the military context here. So thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. Hello, everyone. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Um, So 0 to 3. So 0 to 3's mission is to ensure all babies have a strong start in life. So really what that means for us is that we envision a society that has the knowledge and will to support infants and toddlers in reaching their full potential. Part of the work that we do with military family projects is nestled right under the mission that 0 to 3 has been doing since 1977. Our program stood up just after 9/11 and has been doing work with military families since post 9/11. So very excited to be part of the group here. So the things that we work on at 0 to 3 is really in relation to two specific contracted pieces of work. One is with UCLA and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network through the Protective Factors Framework. And that work is predominantly around informing the field in the new parent support home visitation program. And it's translational research of what's happening out in the latest research and how do we adapt that to the field. And so that way the home visiting managers have the latest information that's across branch. And so we're very excited to be doing some of that work. And then another piece of work that we do is with Army Installation Command, which is with their visitation program, similar to the work that we do with UCLA, but more robust in that that the Army has a very specific niche and need on their installations. And some of that work does bleed over with their domestic violence prevention work and their family advocacy program. And then lastly, or the last two, I should say, is really around PMADS, perinatal mood anxiety disorder. That's work historically that we've had some engagement with in our infant mental health division of work that's occurring at 0 to 3, but more specifically, we're looking at military families and service members, our female service members who may experiencing PMADS. And then what we also recognize that upwards of 5% of PMADS cases can occur in men as well. And then last, military family father engagement and parent training. Really, that's the work that I have passion for. So when Tova gave me a call to be part of the panel, I was very excited because this is some work that I'd done in the past as a Head Start dad as a Head Start administrator. So who are military connected families? Military connected families, it's a pretty big swath in terms of the demographic and population. Really for us, we're looking at, a number of families that are considered active duty families. Those are families that are not in the Guard or Reserve. And so we know that there's just over 1.2 million in the active duty component. And then active duty children make up about 34% of that population. And then if we look at the focus of age ranges 0 to 5, it's 41%, and 6 to 11, it's 32%. So kind of a nice infographic. This is from Military One Source. They publish typically a year after. It's been delayed lately, but if you're looking for demographic information, it's cited there on the bottom in terms of downloads and availability. And then our selected reserves, those are those families that are part of the Reserve or National Guard. And as you can see here, it's similar demographics in the number of percent of children, and then it mirrors typically in the number of children by age group, at least percentage-wise. So what that means is that there's more than 1.2 million active duty members serving across all branches. What's changed in this last go around in terms of demographic is that there's more women serving than men than we saw in previous years. So there's been an uptick in recruitment and retention of our female active duty service members. And the same can be said across the reserve component. We'll skip over what Veterans with Children means. This is all going to be in the slide deck that you're going to be provided. If there's any questions, just reach out. And then some of the things that we recognize is because of the age demographics that our fathers, our parents are much younger, typically as they come through the door. So recognizing we're going to have young millennial parents, we're going to have Gen Z parents. And so some of the headlines that you always see is like the difficulty of what does that look like for engagement and parenting styles. And so we recognize that in the work that we're doing with our military service members. So parenting millennials, the 94% of parents own a smartphone, 71% get their advice online. So these are all things that you have to consider even when we start talking about father engagement and talking about what does it mean to engage fathers? What does the parent-child relationship look like in terms of countering and using technology? So very interesting kind of dynamic that we have to worry about. And then on the horizon, those are the Gen Z parents that are coming, around the corner, if not already starting to have children. So 8 in 10 say they're lonely. We see that trend. And so if you're a young father in this age range, you tend to see some challenges with what does connectedness look like? What do the supports look like? Dr. Boyd talked about some of those supports on the ground and what can folks do. Trauma-informed, evidence-based practices, those things that are very mission critical to be able to serve those dads. And then military connected families aren't always visible. Those military connected families can live across, the 50 states on installation, off installation, outside the continental US. And, we recognize that there's over 4.4 million individuals who make up the total DoD workforce. So that's a combination of your military service members and possibly their spouses who are employed as well and veterans. And so there's a huge number of folks who are military connected who we really want to be able to connect with. And then what are some risk factors? Similar to what Dr. Boyd was saying, some of the same challenges that we see in the general population is what we still see in the military communities. Things like long-term deployments, separation from family during training, long-term training activities or events, relocation, what we call PCS, trauma, either to within the household, PTSD related, just a number of things that can cause some risk factors within the home. And then mental health, parenting styles, and parenting practices, and family communication. What does that look like in terms of what's the cultural norm around military families, and what does that look like? And then financial strain. It also means that all of these terms I've added for you all to review. But what does active duty mean? It's those full-time active duty service members Monday through Friday, sometimes weekends who have that uniform on. What is a base? What is a deployment? Active Guard Reserve are those members who are voluntarily active, duty on a temporary basis based on either state mission or federal mission, or if they're deployed overseas. And then, of course, TDY is your temporary assignment. Those are the things I talked about as if there's a temporary assignment in training. Like we see with the Iran war currently, you're going to see an uptick in either training activities or TDYs. So really, the work that we do is leveraging the protective factors framework for military families. And really what that does is it leverages what we see in military families in terms of really strong, resilient, adaptive traits, including, parental resilience, social connections, either on or off installation, concrete supports in time of need. So when we look at on installation housing needs, food boxes, food insecurity, those challenges impact our junior enlisted service members as well. So the same challenges that young parents will experience out in the general public because they're a young family and may not have ranked up and have that pay, they're going to experience sometimes financial hardships as well. So knowledge of parenting, child development, and then of course social emotional competence of young children. So those are the things that we know are strong for child-parent attachment and bonding, and what does that look like in terms of separation and then coming back together. One of the key things for us is around parent-baby connection, since family functioning has been shown to predict return soldiers' PTSD symptoms. So really the connectedness to families and helping reduce the rates of PTSD symptoms. And then what does that look like in this symbiotic relationship? Go through these slides, and then I'll just end with some of the things that are on installation. Here's a list of things that are available: early child care centers, early intervention programs, and of course our military healthy steps program, which is a care coordination model that's embedded at the medical homes within installations. And then, of course, resources that we have through 0 to 3. Here's a list of resources that we have available, including our Babies on the Home Front app, Military One Source, which I cited. There's a phone number there, Sesame Street for military families, and then some brochures and pamphlets. Those are our references. And I'll end there, Tova, or I can keep on going. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. So that was terrific, and we really appreciate you bringing in the perspective on military-connected families. Thank you, Jonathan. Matthew, if you want to come on screen now, I'm going to introduce you and then turn to you in just a second here. So Dr. Matthew Alemu is an assistant professor of sociology and criminology and criminal justice at Northeastern, where his research broadly examines how experiencing an absent father as a youth influences one's life course. So in his dissertation research, which everyone should check out, he examined how growing up with an absent father informs young Black men's ideologies and intentions for fatherhood and romantic relationships. And I'm going to turn to him to tell us a bit about what he's working on now. So thank you, Matthew.
All right, thanks, Tova. I'll first say I appreciate the opportunity to present my work in the space. I've been an attendee many times at these webinars, and so I'm very grateful to be able to share my work with you all today. I'll first say that I think, like Clinton, I'm also engaged in efforts to both reimagine and contextualize this idea of separation or specifically absence in my case. And so what I do with my work is I take a step back conceptually, and so I look more broadly to reimagine how we understand absence in general, but more specifically and importantly, how we define fathers as absent. And so when we talk about separation or absence, there are unique ways in which this separation occurs. And the goal of my work is to expose that nuance. And most critical is that my work tends to highlight that all absence is not experienced equally. So, for example, there are those non-resident fathers who never see their kids. There's also non-resident fathers who are ever present in their kids' lives. And there's additional nuance and complexity between those two poles, right? So there's non-resident fathers who are gone for a while and come back and reconnect. There's non-resident fathers who live with their children, go to prison, come back. And so the spectrum is really broad, and my work tends to generally highlight that complexity that we tend to overgeneralize. And I have current research out that unpacks this further, and it's not the primary goal of this work I want to share today, though it is really relevant, and I'll highlight how it is so as I go on. But what I want to talk about today is this idea of pervasive absence and its impact on how men both think about fatherhood and relationships. And to help maintain just a picture for you all about how this work I think is relevant, I want you all to imagine either the fathers you may work with, the fathers you may study, or even the fathers you may know. And as you think about them, I want you to imagine that they grew up with an absent father. But even more so that they didn't just experience absence and isolation. They were also kind of in communities where this kind of non-resident father was a common feature, right? And so I want you to maintain this picture as I go on, and I think it'll help crystallize what I want to share today. But also remember that, right, that all these men and their kind of social peers are experiencing different types of absence, right? So like I explained earlier. But so keep this picture as I go on. And so I want to start when I talk about pervasive absence, I like to begin with a muse that's been really motivational and kind of driving the kinds of questions I ask related to pervasiveness. And so this muse includes the late rapper DMX and about a now 15-year-old televised intervention with his estranged son. And in this interview, his son is essentially asking DMX to own and apologize for all the failings he had through his absence. And so as DMX struggles to finally kind of apologize, he attributes his failures as a father to the fact that not only did he himself not grow up with a father, he was also raised in a situation where he didn't know anyone with a father, right? And so, he feels that this lack of a representation of fatherhood disabled him from being the father he wanted to be and led to him failing his son. And so it's a really emotionally charged interview, but also, as a young grad student at the time, it really presented a critical analytical mystery. What exactly does it mean to not know anyone with a father? All right, this really drew me in and became the subject as I began my dissertation research. And more importantly, what are the implications of this collective experience on one's trajectory, both as a father and a partner or husband? And so in keeping this muse in mind, I want to present from some data points from my research. And so just first, so my data comes from working with young Black men who themselves grew up with an absent father, but were not yet fathers themselves. So the goal was to understand how these men were using this experience to construct intentions and ideals for fatherhood. And so considering this revelation from DMX, at a point in my interviews, I would ask the men essentially, how common was absence where you grew up? And to this question, roughly 90% of my respondents said yes, right? So 90% of my respondents said that absence was this very common experience. Right. So, so I confirm it's common. And while this confirms the idea of pervasiveness, it doesn't adequately articulate what exactly pervasiveness looks like. Right. It doesn't really map out how one navigates that in their everyday. And so I was left initially with the same mystery that DMX left me with prior to this research. And so to make sense of this 90% experience, I incorporated what I call kind of two generational lenses to interpret and better comprehend what men mean when they say that absence was common. And so what I specifically did was incorporate two separate generational lenses to interpret kind of the socialization of non-resident fathers. The first lens I use is what I call intragenerational absence. So intragenerational looks at my respondents' siblings, their peers, cousins, schoolmates, all the folks who are being socialized at the same time as them, right? And so in using this intragenerational lens, one particular kind of dynamic emerged as really critical to this idea of pervasiveness. And so it was most kind of concentrated actually in this home dynamic where respondents reported that 77% of their maternal siblings had absent fathers. But even more critically is that 60% reported there being at least three fathers across their siblings. So what this helps us do then is really kind of reimagine household level absence, not as the idea of just one non-resident father missing, but the possibility of three or more, right? And I had respondents who had at least five fathers across their maternal siblings. And so you can see this normalization be a really entrenched experience in the household, right? And so kind of one general kind of example of this normalization comes from Julius, who himself saw his father a few times in his childhood. And so his example really explains this normalization as he talks about he would watch kids get picked up from school every day. And when he would see fathers picking up their kids, his assumption was that they were not living with their kids, right? They were there to take their kids to their mother's house. They were there for a specific outing. But the assumption was always that these fathers are not residential, right? They're just visiting, right? And so you can imagine then if you're socialized in a setting where everyone is experiencing non-residence, you assume that to be the norm. And so intragenerational really exposes that normalization. And then there's also intergenerational absence. And so this captures the ways in which absence persists across time, right? So these respondents were given examples of how their parents or uncles or aunts experienced absence, so from the generation before them. They were also conveying kind of absence being passed on to the next generation when they would talk about their siblings having kids with absent fathers or their brothers becoming absent fathers, and the same for cousins, friends, etc. Right. And so intergenerational absence really captures this persistence of absence over time. And so one example came from a respondent who, after our first interview, realized that his mother had never talked about her father. And so he leaves the first interview and comes back to the second interview with a fairly, really unfortunate example. But his mom shared that her only memory of her father was when he attended one of her birthdays as a kid and dropped off a huge bag of pennies as a present. And that was the last time she ever saw him. And so you can see now, like, this respondent is now the second generation of experiencing absence. And so what do we do with this, right? So, I've been able to map out and kind of specify how pervasive absence looks. But the consequences of these lenses became most evident when I would ask respondents this question. I would ask them, do you have to be married to the mother of your children to be the father you want to be? Right. To this question, almost 80% said no. Right. So 80% don't believe they have to be married to the mother of their child to be the father they want to be. Right. And so I want to emphasize here that this doesn't mean that they don't value marriage, or that they see non-resident fatherhood as an ideal type. Right. What I argue it represents is what I call an internal disassociation of fathering from partnering. Right. These are two important social roles they imagine them to be, but they see them as two separate ventures. Right. And they've never seen the two overlap. And so some examples of how this mental disassociation kind of plays out. There was one respondent, his name was Loki, and he would talk about when he would dream or fantasize about becoming a father one day. And he would talk about how when he would imagine his child or holding his child, or being with this child, he would never imagine a child's mother, right? And so he imagined fatherhood completely void of co-parenting, right? It's just him and his child, and I can't imagine anything else because I've never seen anything else. Um, and so this is the consequences of this normalization of the non-resident father. Um, but so, what do we do with this disassociation? And so what we've tended to do is respond with encouraging healthy marriage, right? But I don't think that this alone is it, right? As I mentioned, these men are not saying that marriage is bad or I don't want to be married, right? They're seeing it as a separate kind of social goal than fatherhood. Right. And so because of this, I don't think the solution is to make them see otherwise. Right. I don't think that we should force them to believe that marriage is the only way. Though I think it is a helpful alternative to offer. But I think most critically and essential is that we emphasize the importance of co-parenting. Right. And so in closing, again, in thinking about the idea of pervasiveness or pervasive absence, right, I think about absence then as this community level issue. And not to indict non-resident fathers at all, but to highlight how kids grow to internalize the reality of their non-residence. And so one consequence is this mental disassociation of partnering from fathering. And this work really highlights a key point of intervention that we should consider that's not just focused on healthy marriage, but also on effective co-parenting. And so that's all I have today. I don't want to take too much time, but again, thank you, Tova, for letting me present in this space.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And I'll just say for everyone that you'll get links to some of the papers he's referenced so you can read more about the work, but it's really helpful to hear how you nuance what a spectrum of things can be captured when we talk about absence, and also bringing in the co-parenting piece, which will also, I think, need to talk more about where co-parents fit into this. So thank you. I am excited to welcome so many colleagues from across the country onto this webinar, and now I get to welcome a colleague whose office is across the hall from mine. So Paha, you can bring up your slides. Thrilled to have you here. Paha is an associate professor here at UW-Madison Santa Rosa School of Social Work, where she is director of the Lab for Family Wellbeing and Justice. She also co-leads the Promote Smart Decarceration Grand Challenge for Social Work. And she's going to share with us a little bit about her research, which focuses on development, implementation, and testing of interventions to promote positive outcomes among families affected by the criminal legal system. So I will turn to you, Paha, and not take more of your time with an introduction.
Thanks so much, Tova, and thanks everyone for coming today. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about justice-impacted fathers specifically and their children, and share a couple of examples of strategies to mitigate the harm that's caused by this particular kind of separation. The photo that you're looking at on the right is a picture of me and a colleague in our local county jail on a Saturday morning playing with a child who's visiting his father. I'll talk more about that particular program, but I share this because it is very much connected to the why I do the work that I do. I did grow up with a single mother with an absent father and a range of father figures in and out of my life. And it definitely, without question, influenced the questions that I ask and the kinds of research that I do to try to bring solutions to this, pervasive social problem. So a little bit more about who I work with, how and where. So my work does focus on justice-involved families, including fathers and mothers too, their children, caregivers at home, and then really key actors who shape their lives in a whole variety of ways. I do this through a variety of approaches: basic research, asking and answering questions, intervention research, which I'll talk about today, teaching, training students, which I think is so important to really helping with the pipeline of who's going to be next in doing this work, and then spending a lot of time on developing a variety of partnerships who make the work possible. In terms of where I do the work, it happens in the places you might expect. So local jails, state prison systems, and then in community reentry spaces, often with nonprofit organizations that are supporting families. So just a little bit of context for those that might not be familiar. It is in fact true that about half of all American prisoners in our state and federal systems are parents of young children. And so what you can see is about 46% of men who are incarcerated are fathers. Almost 60% of women are mothers. But part of the point here, as you can see on the right-hand side, as we know, the vast majority of people who are behind bars are actually men. So just in terms of sheer proportion, most parents who are incarcerated are fathers. And not that this is a contest in any way, shape, or form, but this is why I have spent a good amount of my time focused on incarceration and fathers. In terms of the grave negative consequences that parental incarceration has for children and adults, for kids, there's a whole host of negative outcomes, including behavioral problems, academic and educational challenges, food insecurity, a range of mental health issues, sometimes even diagnosed as late as midlife. For adult partners and for relatives at home, we see relationship strain, depression, anxiety, other kinds of mental health problems, economic insecurity, housing instability, and then for fathers, often a cascading of effects for those that are involved in paying child support, delinquency and arrears that accrue during incarceration. So just a whole host of negative things. I often think that other people who are most directly impacted by far do the best job in terms of explaining what parental incarceration means for them. And so here on the top of the slide are the words of Joshua Martoma, who at the age of 17, the child of an incarcerated father, was quoted in the New York Times student editorial contest as saying, "Parental incarceration is the waste product of mass incarceration. It is a silent American epidemic, more common than childhood asthma." And he's not wrong. And despite evidence that incarceration does not provide safety or justice, and instead perpetuates inequities, racism, and violence, and importantly, family separation, it still is used as the default approach in America, really to solve some of our largest social problems. That's all of the bad news. But the good news is that there are some strategies that are being implemented and have been for some time and are continuing to grow to try to mitigate these harms. And so I'm going to focus now and turn my attention to partnerships in practice, which are really key to conducting both research, building evidence, and then implementing evidence-based models to support fathers, children, and to mitigate these harms. Some of those partnerships for me are often done with correctional institutions, again, prisons, jails, judges, and then with other key stakeholders. So credible messengers, so those who are directly impacted, other researchers, nonprofit organizations, advocates, and so on. I can't emphasize enough how critical these kinds of partnerships are to solving these really, really difficult problems. So I'm going to share one example called Parenting Inside Out. So this is not my intervention, but it is a model that I have been researching, collaborating around and with, and helping to implement for many years in Wisconsin and other places. It's an evidence-based, manualized curriculum. It was designed specifically for incarcerated parents. Its objectives include giving parents skills to be really the most effective parents that they can be, whether they're parenting from inside of a jail or in a community reentry space. The second objective is to reduce the impact of parental incarceration on the child by helping a parent to maintain contact with their child. And then finally, to reduce recidivism through really building strong family connections. It's been associated with a host of positive outcomes, including decreased arrests after release, decreased substance use, and then importantly for the parent and the child, increased use of positive reinforcement and positive parenting practices, and a decrease in poor disciplinary practices. As you can see on the right, it is probably, to my knowledge, the most commonly used evidence-based parenting skills intervention model in the country. It's used in almost all states and even in several countries. There's a variety of curriculum versions, so shorter ones for those who are implementing it in jail settings, and then others slightly longer for community reentry spaces, and then a couple of versions for prison settings. As you can see on the right, it has been implemented in several of our state prisons here in Wisconsin, just as an example, both with fathers and with mothers. In our local county jail, after implementing it for several years, we went on to expand that particular partnership. We added what are called child-friendly visits, and so that loops back to the photo that you saw on the first slide. And so my colleagues and I and a large group of volunteer students from UW-Madison spend the first Saturday of every month supporting fathers' visits with their children. So caregivers, mothers, grandparents, cousins, bring the children, drop them off, and dads get to spend an hour and a half playing, reading, eating, listening to music, sitting on laps, holding hands, laughing, and yes, sometimes also crying. But this has become one of the most meaningful, I would say, partnerships that we have been able to implement, and we are now studying the effects of what those partnerships and those visits can mean for dads and their kids. I have done a variety of, as I mentioned, types of research on PIO, and the reports and papers are available, whether that's a toolkit to help jails and prisons that are interested in trying to implement this kind of a model, some information about a feasibility study and acceptability of what it means to parents who participated in a community reentry space. So just pointing out some of those. We are about to send off findings on a multi-site evaluation based on 3 different evaluations of parenting inside out in local jails, both in Wisconsin and Minnesota. Importantly, some of those findings have shown really positive impacts on father and child contact during incarceration, and then increased ability and really likelihood of fathers being able to show and express love and affection with their children, even during that really, harmful period of separation. And so just to say that there are some positive strategies that can be used. There are other examples, and I'm just going to highlight one here quickly because I know I'm running short on time, but the Literacy Link, which comes out of the UW Division of Extension, has a model called Making Reading Memories, where parents who are incarcerated participate in a workshop. They are then able to select a book, read that book to their child that is video recorded, and then that book and that recording is sent home to the child and to the caregiver at home, where that child often watches that video and reads the book over and over again. For time purposes, I'm going to just share very, very quickly a final response from an incarcerated parent about his experience in the Parenting Inside Out program. And I won't have time to read the whole thing, but I just want to share a couple of his words about being in that both Parenting Inside Out program and the child-friendly visits. He starts out by saying how important it was for him to be in the program and how surprised he was, et cetera, et cetera. He went on to say that one of the last lessons that was discussed in that class had to do with logical consequences and logical rewards. And he says that the logical reward ultimately was the one that was the most amazing ever. And it was those 3 contact visits that the Dane County Sheriff's Office so generously offered to allow him and his classmates to have with their children. And he said, you see, from the time of a parent's arrest until they are actually sent to prison, if that's the case, it could be months or even years before the parent can physically bond with their child. So for that reason, these contact visits mean more than you could ever imagine to our families. Thank you for helping to keep us on track and to have a fun and educational experience. Hopefully this program will be around for many years to come. And so with that, I'll close and we can go to Q&A. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask if all of our panelists could come back on camera, and we have a short time for questions and discussion. Where I'd like to start, just looking at what's in the Q&A box and what's come in advance of the webinar and questions, is thinking about how this work also encompasses or pays attention to co-parents, to mothers, to grandparents, to others who may be caring for kids in the position of supporting or gatekeeping around relationships with fathers during times of separation. So there was a question in the Q&A box there asking you to expand, Matthew, on how you think about co-parenting. And I know others, certainly in the work that you do, it also encompasses a whole family. So I'm going to invite kind of thoughts from each of you about how we support the whole family, including co-parents.
Sure. I mean, one thing that came up a lot was that it wasn't necessarily that men were anti co-parenting, right? For a lot, they just couldn't imagine it, right? It's like fatherhood was kind of theirs and theirs alone. So the idea of having to share that when they've never seen others share it, was really critical. I think that for some, I think that it's about kind of introducing just the importance of it, even if they don't understand that, um, you may not love the mother of your child, but you should have a really effective working relationship with her to raise this kid. And I think that's where a lot of men just weren't aware of that facet, right? That it's like, I may not be in love with this person or need this person, but I need this person to raise this person. And I think just introducing the importance of that, and then tools of how they can kind of nurture that kind of more working relationship versus a romantic one, I think will go a long way for a lot of folks.
Jonathan, would you like to say a little bit about the support to whole families surrounding
Sure.
deployment or temporary duty assignments? Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I think when we look at like military families or structures that now if they're on installation, sometimes they'll have, assuming that they're together, that the couple is together, that you'll have auntie or grandma or grandpa or someone, right, multi-generational households. What we've been hearing, and I know some of this was in the previous Q&A ahead of the webinar today, but I think some of the challenges we're hearing from the field is that for our Latinx or Latino families is that they typically would bring a mother-in-law or a mom with them to duty stations as kind of that nested care provider. And because of documented status, have experienced some challenges now. Not only that, but our on installation requirements to get an on and off installation put under very strict policies now. And so we're hearing from the field that those families are now trying to rethink what does the support system look like? Is it culturally sensitive to their needs and their family kind of environment and dynamic? And then those that are separated, I think what we found with single dads, because there are some single dads in the military, that the supports that they're experiencing are not the same, right? There's some assumption. Dr. Boyd talked about this. I think Matthew talked about this. Is this idea that the workforce, whether it's social work, child development centers, all the normal places that dads would go to interact, they're not considered the primary parent. And if they are not the primary parent, what does that engagement look like? And so what we are hearing from the field is that, one of the things that staff can do, and this is something I used to do when I was at Head Start, was to really look at those initiatives and those efforts to engage dads in a very intentional way, to bring in other dads that may have a good footprint, good relationship with staff, and so that way they can help recruit other dads. And that's something that's how I got recruited on the Parent Policy Council as Head Start. I never wanted to be on Policy Council, but there I was, a 19, 20-year-old dad. And so you just find ways to really connect with fathers in a way that is genuine and that is authentic. And I think when we talk about co-parenting, those are those challenges that we really have to look at our assumptions and our preconceived notions on what it means to be engaged. A lot of great dialogue today. I'm sure we can probably have another hour on this, but I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to just say briefly for folks who are putting in questions in the Q&A, we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I encourage you to reach out to our panelists to continue the conversation. And then Clinton, I'd just like to turn to you to talk a little bit about kind of family work as part of your fatherhood work.
Right. Yeah, no, I really appreciate the question because one important distinction that I've long noticed and seen in our work is that co-parenting often looks very different for younger fathers compared to older fathers. And that difference has a lot to do with like life stage, stability, and really the support systems around them. So, for example, when we think about many younger fathers, co-parenting tends to be much more collective and family centered. And that's largely tied to the fact that they are often still embedded within households of like either their parents or extended family members. And as a result, co-parenting like frequently involves like a broader ecosystem that could include aunts, uncles, grandparents, and sometimes even close family friends, right? And so in situations like that, the father is not only like navigating a relationship with the child's mother, but also relationships with multiple adults who have a responsibility in helping to raise that child. Whereas when we think about older fathers, co-parenting just looks completely different in my experience. Many of those fathers, as they become older, the co-parenting relationship, in my view, is often more like structured and like bilateral, and it's like primarily centered on the relationship between that father and and the child's mother. And so it just presents a unique opportunity and unique challenges for fathers, older fathers who may be navigating co-parenting relationships in that way, especially if it's an acrimonious or conflictual relationship that exists between those two. With the younger fathers, I've noticed that sometimes those additional family members can oftentimes serve as a buffer or a mediator in some type of conflicts that may be emerging between the child's mother and the younger father. You just don't have as much of an opportunity to do that with older fathers, based on my experience. And even some of the research literature points to this as well.
Thank you. Hallie, if you'll let us run over by a minute or two, I'm going to ask Paha to respond and then sneak in one more question and then we'll have to wrap up. So you're up, Paha.
Okay, great. I think as a general premise, it's important for policymakers, practitioners, researchers, whatever space you're operating in, to always approach this question from a whole family lens. So, if we're designing a new program or implementing something, to think about how can we bring in both caregivers at home or co-parents and, in my case, incarcerated fathers. Historically, I think, particularly from a policy lens, we have often siloed fathers and focused on mothers and children. As a social worker, right, we are trained to think about whole systems, and that includes whole families. So I think just starting with that as the basic premise is a simple but important, change or shift that we need to make.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask one last question and then we'll have to wrap up. And that is for each of you, if there are, policies that you'd like to see. We got a number of questions that were about what kind of policy changes would expand support for fathers and families, and wondering if there are policy recommendations that you have that kind of speak to some of the needs that you identified. And maybe we'll go in reverse here, Paha, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, happy to do that. I didn't get a chance to talk about this today, but I'm really shifting my work from intervention to prevention. So, I could spend the rest of my career focusing on how to mitigate the harms of incarceration, but instead, I think we need to move towards prevention. So specifically deflection, diversion, and alternatives to incarceration, so that we can prevent fathers and mothers from being separated from their children. And happy to talk to anybody about that offline if anybody's interested.
Would like to take that one next? Anyone who, Matthew, you're unmuted. May I turn to you?
Sure. I don't think about policy in that specific of a sense, but I can say, one of the major interventions I can think of is typically what my interviews, I think, prove to be, right. Most of the men I would talk to almost every time said, I've never talked about this stuff before. I've never talked about how my father impacted me. I've never talked about how I felt about his absence. And when I think about, the topic I shared today, this pervasive absence, like for a lot of men, this parenthood is kind of their personal redemption story, right? They're trying to make up for what their father didn't give them. And I think that we need to find better ways to create spaces for men just to literally share and talk about these things that are driving and impacting their intentions and ideals around fatherhood. And what we build from that, I think, can then be more kind of person informed versus kind of ideal informed.
Thank you. And we can broaden if you'd prefer to speak to changes more broadly than policy. Thank you, Matthew. But Clinton and Jonathan, I'll invite kind of closing thoughts from each of you about things you would like to see to address some of the issues you've named.
Yeah, well, I think reiterating something that Paha shared is really thinking about fatherhood and father engagement as a central component to like family stability and community safety. I think oftentimes we place fatherhood out in the margins and conveniently neglect the fact that fathers are a part of the family. And so it is just going to be very important for us to continue to acknowledge that, recognize it, and also make sure at a structural level we're devoting the necessary resources to make sure that we have systems and policies and programs in place that reinforce that as a fact. The last point that I'll make is we really need to make stronger investments in more community-based pre prevention programs because again, we really need to think more intentionally about what does it look like to support fathers before crisis even occurs. And that can include not just fatherhood initiatives, but even thinking about behavioral health services, mentoring, community violence interventions that stabilize families and really reduce a lot of the pressures that often lead to separation in the first place. And so, again, we need to fund prevention and not punishment.
Thank you so much, Clinton. And I'm going to turn to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, just I think, building on what everyone has already stated, which is, how do we get from big P policy to, grassroots level prevention intervention services on the ground? And I think, one of the things that we have to be thoughtful and mindful of is that I think Matthew really stated this is like listening to to those in the community, those dads, those fathers, wherever they're at on the spectrum, right, of parenting, whether it's co-parenting or within the household, as with the significant mother. I think we really got to be mindful and thoughtful of that because those supports, whether it's in the community, mental health supports, economic supports, really take a toll on men's mental health, and that child parent engagement and the child parent bonding, that dyadic relationship between dad and child can be impacted in such a powerful way by just having the father supported and bringing a different lens to what that looks like to parent and that influence on that child's life long term. So that's all I'm going to say. I know we're out of time. So.
Thank you all so much. That went fast. I'm going to turn it back to you, Hallie, and just remind everyone that you'll get copies of the slides and link to the recording in hopes that you'll kind of reach out with follow-up questions for our presenters. And thank you all
That's right.
so much.
Thanks so much to our presenters today, Tova Walsh, Clinton Boyd, Jonathan Gonzalez, Matthew Alemu, and Paha Charles for sharing time, experience, and insights with us today. And thank you so much for such an engaged audience and for joining us as well. Just a reminder, as Tova mentioned, we will be posting the recording of the webinar and slides within a couple of days, and you will receive a link. If you registered for this webinar, you'll receive that link by email. Thanks so much for joining us and have a great rest of your day.